So Michael Charles Tobias is the president of the Dancing Star Foundation, which is an ecological NGO focused on biodiversity, conservation, animal protection, and the environmental education. He has been active professionally for 45 years doing field work in what now exceeds more than 100 different nations on this planet. How amazing it is that one can say that. In his discussion today, I'll be speaking about observations and experiences in places like Bhutan, like Mozambique, and Antarctica. Michael has written and published 45 books. He has authored and recorded 35 different musical compositions, and he has made more than 150 films, each of which has been aired in broadcast. All of this is a life's work that challenges human sustainable interactivity with our biosphere. It's my pleasure to introduce Michael Tobias.
Thank you, Dr. Noonan. I'm extraordinarily grateful to be here with my distinguished friends and colleagues and to have a wonderful audience in a wonderful, balmy Buffalo day. It's quite unusual. Everything I'd read about Buffalo most recently, I expected I'd be crawling through about 8 feet of snow or something to that effect. So I'm really happy to be here. In addition to Bhutan and Mozambique and the Antarctic, I'm going to be actually speaking about a number of other countries as well, including New Zealand and beginning with Ecuador. But before I show you a 20-minute film that I was commissioned to direct for the government of Ecuador and premiered in 3D at the Rio 20 Plus 20 Summit, United Nations Summit 2012, I want to just say a few words about the film, and then after the film plays, which is about 19.5 minutes, I'll be able to discuss at some depth and greater length some of the issues that I'm really focused on. I come from an animal rights and conservation biology perspective. It's been the perspective that I've had personally ever since I was 3 years old and was taken on what I suppose some would call an ecotourist outing by my father on a foggy Sunday morning in San Francisco to the zoo, where I saw a wolf in a cage, and I asked my dad why that gorgeous wolf was in jail. And my father looked at me and said, "Welcome to the world, kid." And I've been an activist and a conservationist ever since, focused very devotedly on the relationship between our species and all the other species we're so blessed to share this miraculous planet with. And when I was a kid, apparently, I'm told, the number of known species was somewhere in the neighborhood of 1.3 million. Then it went to 1.5 million, then 1.8 million. Well, today, if we include the cyanobacteria in the marine environs, though consensus is nowhere near consensual, we estimate there could be as many as 100 million species sharing this planet with us. And each one of those species has anywhere from a few hundred to billions of individuals. We know for a fact that the Rocky Mountain locust in the 1870s weighed 25 million tons in a single eruption, and it's estimated that there were 12.5 trillion individuals of just one species. But we should take heed, because within 30 years of the 1870s, when that species erupted, in a single mass the size of the state of California, it went extinct. A few were left in the Grasshopper Glacier of Montana. And then, of course, last year we celebrated, unhappily, the 100th anniversary of the extinction of the passenger pigeon with Martha, also at a zoo, the Cincinnati Zoo. So we are only too aware of the fact that our very tenuous relationship with the natural world is predicated upon a very real fact, namely, we impact our world. And ecotourism, biocultural tourism, wilderness tourism, adventure tourism, really commenced, if you will, with that expeditionary impulse in all of us to go beyond the horizon, to see what's there in the next valley. When we came down out of the trees and started wandering across savannas and looked for food sources, looked for mates, looked for new territory, all of that accumulates to the moment. And here we are, wondering what is socially responsible, what is ethical, what is within the realm of compassion as we go about our ways in continuing to perpetuate that marvelous impulse in ourselves to explore and to be with other species and with individuals of those species, and to be able to, need I say, get as close as possible and look them in the eye, if they have eyes, and feel that compulsion, which is clearly part of the nurturing experience as mammals we've grown up with and depend upon for our soul and our survival and for the future of this beautiful earth. Would you believe that of the 5 species of gnats, one of them, Arachnocampa luminosa, which in its larval phase has bioluminescence and looks like a glowworm, was discovered in 1889 in a limestone cave by a Maori chief, and he and his wife in New Zealand, 3 hours today south of Auckland, opened it up for ecotourism. Insect tourism, which we'll be hearing later in this symposium about other insect tourism modalities. But it's amazing to me that after the Grand Tour and the romantic infatuation with places like Mont Blanc and all of Europe, if you were coming from somewhere other than Europe, that romantic vision was perpetuated and in 1889 became gnat tourism. And it was a hit, and it remains so in the Waitomo caves to this day. It's a huge hit. Well, insect tourism has a bigger role to play in a geopolitical sphere in Ecuador, in the World Biosphere Preserve known as Yasuni National Park in Ecuador. And I'm going to show you a film, the film that we premiered at the Rio Plus 20 United Nations Summit. And it will raise a lot of issues about tourism, about our relation to the natural world, about the spirituality implicit in the summons that we are brought together to puzzle through the many complex factors inherent to the corporate and stewardship and indigenous rights and animal rights related targets that ecotourism, this massive industry that keeps growing, must wrestle with. So with that, I'm going to show you this film.
Encontró ese lugar en el siglo XV y vio que es el mejor lugar para meditar en ese lugar. Es el lugar de meditación.
Mr. Vice President, thank you so much.
Un nuevo cambio hacia la espiritualidad, más que hacia la materialidad, es la expectativa que debemos crear en nuestros niños y en nuestros jóvenes. Y ellos tienen la obligación de seguir esa línea que se está generando, esa línea que los ecologistas están marcando, redireccionando prácticamente la relación del hombre con la naturaleza.
it is such a big responsibility, because what do you feel when I first came, and the first feeling is that you're so close to God here. It's creation, pure creation, and we can't touch this. I mean, this cannot be touched, and the feeling is what a responsibility. We have to do whatever it's possible just to keep this place intact. It couldn't be. You saw the places where you have the oil and how different it feels. Well, they feel the same, the people that live here. And it's for them, it's for life, it's for not only the people of the Amazon, of Ecuador, but also to the people of the world. Gracias. Gracias. Hola, ¿qué tal? ¿Cómo están?
So there's people, there's diversity of plants. Only in one 2.2 acre plot, 1 hectare square shape in Yasuni National Park, you can find more than 500 species of woody trees. This is a world record. This place is considered to be the biggest diversity in Amazonia, and it happens to be right in this part of Ecuador. And the reason for this is because we are in the deepest corner in the western part of Amazonia, so close to the Andes, to the chain mountain, to the highlands. It is one of the reasons that diversity in Amazonia, in Ecuador, is so special and so unique. ¿Qué es lo que tú entiendes acerca de la palabra ecoturismo? ¿Qué es para ti el ecoturismo?
Nosotros aquí nosotros no talamos los
No
árboles,
cutting trees, no logging,
cuidamos al bosque,
protecting the
no cazar los
environment and the
animales.
forest, and no hunting.
Demostrar nuestra cultura como es no olvidar y
And something very important, show our culture to the world. That's what she understands about ecotourism.
Yeah. There's so many burrowing birds. Over 2,000 tree species are known to exist in Yasuni. Yasuni hosts one of the world's richest communities of flowering plants. The world's highest recorded number of vertebrates per square kilometer, with an astonishing 121 reptile species. 141 known amphibian types, rare freshwater creatures, at least 630 bird species. Across Yasuni, there are at least 169 different mammalian species. Most amazingly, Yasuni is the world's capital for insects and spiders, with as many as 45,000 different species in every acre. Every individual being in Yasuni is unique. We search to know them, to marvel at their beauty. But their mysteries and dignity may well be essential to the world.
No existe forma de amar a los demás si primero no aprendemos a amarnos a nosotros mismos, que amemos esta naturaleza maravillosa, que pensemos en que debemos heredarla a nuestros hijos, que respetemos a los mayores, que respetemos el conocimiento por la experiencia, que respetemos las canas. También el respeto debe ser de ida y vuelta por parte de los adultos. Podemos formar un mundo mejor. De un conjunto de localizaciones posibles de la realidad, podemos escoger la mejor, porque siempre hemos de tener la tendencia pesimista a escoger lo peor. Escojamos siempre lo mejor.
let me show you this. It is quite unique and special. Look at this. What we have here, it is what we consider to be one of the greatest predators in the rainforest of Amazonia. This is a species of army ant. It happens to be the biggest of all. There's about 30 species of them. They're considered the greatest predator because the amount and quantity and variety of prey that they eat. And what is special about this little ant that I'm holding, which happens to be the soldier, look at the size of those pincers. These are called surgeon ants. In the past, the people that live in Amazonia use these ants as stitches. So if somebody had an open cut or an open wound that was bleeding, they use the pincers of the head of this ant to close the wound, twist the body, leave the head, and you can have stitches. Once it bites, it cannot let go because it's sharp and it's inside of my skin. So I can make the ant do this harder and it will actually close part of my skin, and then all I have to do is twist the body and I will have stitches.
That's fascinating.
The lesson from this is never play with army ants, respect them, and just love them, admire them.
Fascinating. Fascinating.
There is a background of knowledge and education that has been passed through generations for hundreds, even thousands of years. Most of that knowledge is not written. You don't find that in books. In some cases, it's being lost every time somebody dies. So the knowledge each of these people have in their brains about the plants, about the animals, it is just simply amazing.
Si todos tenemos optimismo, con toda seguridad vamos a tener un resultado positivo. Yo creo que debemos desacelerar un poco el ritmo de la inflación tecnológica destinada al consumo. Paremos un momento, démonos un descanso, seamos un remanso que haga que cambiemos nuestra concepción de vida hacia una concepción de una evolución más dedicada al cuidado de la naturaleza y al cuidado de nosotros mismos. Un poco más de espiritualidad sería la recomendación a la reunión de Río. Nosotros somos los que construimos cada día, los que construimos de a poco el futuro. El futuro va a ser un futuro maravilloso. Tengo fe en ello.
That was the Vice President, Lenin Moreno, singing at the end. Yasuni, I chose to show for this gathering because, among other things, back in the early 1980s, first the 1980s, but then definitively in the early 1990s, entomologists from the Smithsonian extrapolated data, and based upon a lot of monitoring, it was determined that it's likely that there are more invertebrates in Yasuni than any place on the planet. In a sense, you could claim it as a kind of birthplace for future genetic terrestrial evolution on Earth. And so the protection of Yasuni has been really in the focus of conservation biology and animal rights throughout the world. And it is the case that given the recent decision by the government to go forward and exploit that oil, notwithstanding the plummeting price of oil today, in January of 2015, with a barrel of oil less than half what it was. Nonetheless, the mitigation of climate change by protecting that forest was a brilliant vision of the presidency of Rafael Correa and his cohorts under the auspices of the United Nations for the ITT initiative. We don't know what the outcome will be, but we do know that the cultures, the 4 tribes and the 2 uncontacted tribes that live in the national park and surrounding zones, so-called, have engendered what, for my money, is certainly one of the very finest ecotourist lodges and total systems anywhere on the planet. 100% of the revenues go back to the indigenous people. Everything is absolutely recycled. As you heard from the young woman who's vested in the entire community ownership of the lodge, which you saw that one image of on the lake from the helicopter. There's no hunting. The cuisine is astounding. There's no logging. But now they find themselves in a global environment of geopolitical contradictions and the exploitation of oil. This is not unique to Yasuni, but Yasuni is unique to the world. And it's emblematic for me of so many other parts of the planet where we are confronted with this dialectic that we have to grapple with because we are all interdependent with Yasuni. Pre-Miocene, pre-10 million years ago, pre-Andes, those neotropics were there, the lungs of this planet. Now, when I first went to the Antarctic, back in the mid-1980s, to make several films for PBS, including Antarctica, the Last Continent, when the revelations of ozone depletion and whatnot were hitting the world media, I saw things by tourists, how very few there were then, largely coming through Buenos Aires down to Ushuaia, taking a ship across a couple of days through the Straits of Magellan, the Drake Passage. Unlike Dr. Noonan, who just came back the other day, I'm told, and had flat water, we had 150-foot swells, and we were traveling with the Argentine military. I was with the defense minister of Argentina to go to Esperanza, the first base in Antarctica. And I confess I was there on my honeymoon, but it was something that I had to do, and my wife was not prepared to go crawling through penguin guano, but she was a great sport, fell madly in love, and transformed herself from an opera singer to an ecologist right there on the spot, which is how it should happen. Although I miss her singing Puccini, but she now knows a lot about penguins. Since that time, when people were picking out lichen at the risk of paying $10,000 fines, which most of them didn't know about existed, for example, in the United States, if you take anything from the Antarctic. Ships were still pouring bilge into the water. There was open burning in the dumps at the military bases. People were going up trying to pet southern elephant seals, walking everywhere on lichen, which are the redwoods of the Antarctic. A lot of changes have taken place since that time. We know, for example, with respect to the Antarctic, that in 2012 to 2013, there were approximately 506,000 touchdowns by people in the Antarctic. That means 12 individuals on a Zodiac going into a place to photograph, to climb, to kayak. These days, of course, to go scuba diving. I say of course because when I was first in the Antarctic, there wasn't scuba diving going on. But a lot has changed, and the various ratifications and changes to the 1959 Antarctic Treaty have enforced a level of ecotourist responsibility of entrepreneurial stewardship, which is far more in touch with the notion first proposed by the country of New Zealand for an Antarctic World Park, which was shared at the time by Greenpeace, but never really resonated, unfortunately, with many countries vying for sovereignty in a place 12,000 square miles of ice that should have no weapons, that should have absolutely minimum harm, limited intrusion, if any. Of course, it is the truth that the US did have a nuclear power base at McMurdo Sound, which was eventually taken out. So last year, something like 40,000 tourists, as I understand it, went to the Antarctic. There are heavy pressures on many areas of the Western Peninsula, and it is a very delicate balancing act in a place like the Antarctic. Conversely, in a place like Mozambique, where you have some spectacular preservation and a resurgence of tourism as a result of the aftermath of the tragic liberation from Portugal and then the subsequent civil war that lasted more than a decade. Finally, a Ministry of Tourism was put in place in the 90s, and now you have national parks like Gorongosa, and you also have the southernmost coral reefs. And tourists are flocking to Mozambique. They're going to the Ile de Nyaka, only a few hours by ferry from the capital, Maputo. And they're planning an international peace park in the capital of Maputo, which they hope will attract millions of people. They want it to be something like the sister park to Central Park in Manhattan. And they have every reason to be optimistic, because here is an instance where you have indigenous habitat, because it was the military depot. Malajin, it's called. And unlike Central Park, which was designed, of course, by great landscape designers, and now sees some 30 million visitors a year, generating equal amounts in terms of dollars for the Central Park Conservancy, Maputo is bigger by 4 times and has indigenous habitat, which has not been visited by humans other than a few hundred military who were stationed there for many years, and then they left. And now the president has vowed it will become the biggest city park on the continent of Africa. In New Zealand, where you have that tradition I referenced earlier, where a Maori chief and his wife opened up limestone caves for ecotourism, we have seen since that time in that country the clean green mantra debated feverishly. 14 national parks, the most recent being Rockayura National Park on Stewart Island, and a country which conservation biologists label the capital of extinctions. There are more bioinvasives in New Zealand than there are natives at this point. And if present trends continue, New Zealand is going to see the extinction of its moniker, its national icon, the kiwi. Ecotourism to New Zealand surpassed dairy farming and dairy exports as the #1 income generator for that country several years ago, which was huge for New Zealand. And the question that we are all asking is to what extent the revenues are actually going back down, as they are in Yasuni, to the locals, since so many of the tour operators originate overseas. The other issue in New Zealand that's a real tough one, but resonates with ecotourism worldwide and wildlife tourism worldwide, is that because New Zealand is an island awash in bioinvasives, the Mustelidae family, the weasels, the ferrets, the stoats, and of course the possum, which was introduced in 1843 to a little town known as Riverton, just west of Invercargill, the southernmost city on the South Island. Introduced for sport hunting, it ran rampant like rabbits in Australia, and so a hunting industry developed. And there is this huge debate about, is it really clean and green in New Zealand? And I'm not going to go there because I don't have the time today to discuss it, but my wife and I wrote a 600-page book called God's Country, the New Zealand Factor, which you can download for free, and it examines under a microscope such issues as ecotourism in New Zealand and what's involved there. Now in Bhutan, where I've had a really long relationship, having first led a tour there in 1974. It was one of the first 2 tours to Bhutan, in fact. I'd written an ecotourist catalog for one of the first ecotourist companies, Mountain Travel, which then became Sobek. And Tenzing Norgay, the Sherpa who first climbed Everest, and I went to Bhutan together and took 16 tourists, each of whom paid about $300 a day, which was a huge bargain, because that included everything. And in that year, the Bhutanese authorities were thinking, well, we're going to set the limit at 100 people, because otherwise it's going to be so invasive in this bastion of Mahayana Buddhism, we just can't imagine more than 100 people visiting our country. Well, today, going to Bhutan is a very simple matter, and I urge you to go. The Bhutanese are spectacular, and their model is gross national happiness, not gross national product. And there are approximately 100,000 tourists going there each year now. 50,000 of them driving up from India or flying up from India, the other coming from around the world. Has it changed the country? Absolutely. I could list the ways. Is it a good thing? Is it a bad thing? I think those are silly questions. The inevitability of people wanting to visit one of the most magnificent, peaceful, and extraordinarily beautiful country in the world, Bhutan, is going to happen. And how the Bhutanese are dealing with it is very interesting, and I urge you to examine that model. It's a model that has learned the lessons, in some cases the hard way, from places like Amboseli in Kenya, a national park in Kenya, which after a few hours bumpy drive from Nairobi, you will see the largest aggregate of terrestrial vertebrates anywhere on the planet. But when I first went there to do a study of herbivores versus carnivores and ratios and so forth, I was astonished to see tour guides vying with one another and talking with one another, whispering in their little radio telephones, who can get to the lions who are mating 2 miles to your left, 1 mile to your right, disrupting animal behavior, absolutely trespassing in every way, every transgression imaginable. Well, that has changed too. We're learning rapidly, and we better learn rapidly because we're going to be 9.5 billion. Now that represents, in a $3 trillion current industry, which sees roughly 1.5 to 2.5% of that going to explicit ecotourism, huge opportunities for mitigation, remediation, cross-cultural exchanges, but it also poses an enormous threat to the ever-shrinking reality of habitat and integrity for wildlife. And given the fact that we now know that 2014 was the warmest year on the planet and the implications that's wreaking for every species, especially in places like Yasuni and in Bhutan with glacier overflooding of lakes and enormous problems for export of water and so on, I think tourism and responsible tourism has a role to play that goes well beyond the industry itself, but becomes an advocacy for wildlife, for animal rights, for biocultural heritage, for indigenous rights. Half the folks who came to the Rio Summit a couple years ago were indigenous peoples, demanding that their voice be heard on behalf of the animals that are part of their entire world, their whole universe. And we owe it to ourselves, we owe it to them to make sure that our operational protocols, our standards, and the ethics by which we guide people, travel with people, and shoulder the burden of the incredible joys of travel to such places, that we act with compassion with wisdom and with common sense, and that we act with self-restraint. Hence, in 1964, when we passed the wilderness legislation in the United States and started setting quotas, it was a good thing, in my opinion. It was an absolutely essential thing, and William Douglas was brilliant in seeing the demographic surge that would translate into ecotourism, overcrowding of parks, and even in the legislation for the National Park Service in this country and so many other services around the world, we've heard, and it's been ordained and enshrined in the literature, that people should be able to visit parks and wild areas in a style to which they are accustomed. That was the original 1916 Organic Act language, which was the enshrinement of our National Park Service. So think about that, because if you're going to travel at the style to which you're accustomed in a place like Antarctica or Bhutan, you're kidding yourself. As we approach 10 billion bipedal, ungainly, largely carnivorous Homo sapiens, we have got to get our act together ethically. We have got to recognize we are all interdependent, that every one of those bugs, if you will, they're not true bugs, but some of them were, that you saw in the Yasuni film, deserve our respect. We are dependent on them. They've been there for tens of millions of years. So we have the models in place to get it right. And I'm really challenging all of my peers here to confront the ethical and animal rights issues inherent to corporate stewardship, because that is going to be a monumental task. Thank you.